Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. I'm here today with author and my Henry Jackson Society friend and colleague Douglas Murray to speak about his new book, The Strange Death of Europe. Douglas, thank you for joining me on this fascinating topic. Could you start by giving us maybe the top lines? What's your top line argument in, say, 90 seconds about the themes in this book?
Well, the main thing is that during the migration crisis, which peaked in 2015, or really broke out in 2015, I was traveling the continent from the islands of reception in Greece and Italy where migrants were coming in, and following the story through Europe, through Northern Europe, to the places they end up. And it became my very clear and strong view that what was happening was, for Europe, suicidal. That Europe was literally deciding to destroy and kill itself. And I suppose that there are two particularly significant things that I say in the book have happened simultaneously. One is the mass movement of people into Europe, and the second is the fact that this would happen at precisely the moment that European civilization has utterly lost faith in itself, its desire to continue, or any particular belief in its decency or goodness, believing instead that Europe should basically be the home for anyone in the world who would like to call it home.
Well, I know the subtext of your book, to lead on from that, is immigration, identity, Islam. Now, you've just given me immigration and identity. What does the Islam part have to do with the first two?
The Islam bit is that I say that I believe in the possibility of integration. I think there are many individuals and communities that have integrated into European society and have breathed the air of Europe and effectively become European. I think that the one that is least likely to do that, is going to continue to find it hardest, is a community that believes and follows Islam. I think that Islam is a serious values challenge to modern European society, because, you see, we think that if Amber Rudd or Theresa May or Emily Thornberry tells people this is what you should be like, that they will be like that. And as I say, it's very likely that if Allah says something to the contrary of Emily Thornberry, Amber Rudd, Theresa May, to take just three examples, that they'll choose to follow Allah rather than these here today, gone tomorrow politicians. So I believe that we've made a very fundamental mistake on this, that we are wrong to believe that simply because you are in Europe, you will believe in the values of Europe. And as I put it at one point in the book, I think more and more Europeans have started to realize this in recent years. Or to put it another way, we've been walking down a street which we thought was a one-way street, a liberal street, a street towards more liberalism and so on. And then in some point in recent decades, you could say it was 1989 with the Rushdie affair that it first started, we got the intimations of our own mortality. We saw somebody walking the other way down the street, and then we began to notice more people walking the other way. And suddenly it started to strike more and more Europeans that maybe one day there will be more people walking against our direction than in it. And this is one of the subterranean fears, and I think a legitimate fear of the European publics, particularly, I point out in the book, in a long section on the French debate in France.
Well, what you've said is fascinating, but it will be, I think, somewhat uncomfortable viewing potentially for the Jewish viewers of this show, who will, of course, have come from an immigrant community, will have heard similar discussions at the time of mass Jewish immigration into Western Europe. As you all know, Jews have been prominent in the debate about immigration and refugees, that kind of argument, suggesting that we should be more liberal on this.
Yes.
What's your message to those people?
That's a very important question. Firstly, I mean, you're right. Jewish immigration to Britain has been one of the most notable and successful, I think, immigrations into Britain. Another one which I think most people would cite would be the famous Huguenot immigration after 1681. So
But at the time, if you remember, we had things like the Aliens Act coming in to try and restrict it on precisely the terms you're suggesting.
Yes. There are two things that are different. The first is the sheer numbers. The numbers, which, I mean, we were talking tens of thousands for those times. Tens of thousands of people come in every few weeks to the UK now, and have done for the last 20 years. And the UK has dodged the main body of the recent European migration crisis. A single island in Italy, Lampedusa, where I write a bit of the book from, gets roughly 6,000 people in 24 hours on an average day in the summer, like a spring like this one. So the numbers coming in are totally, totally different. It's like having the Jewish migration you talk of, many, many times over for decades. The second thing is the values thing. It's my strong belief, and I have a lot of stats and data in the book about this as well as observation. My belief is that there are systems and values which show themselves to be malleable and show themselves to want to integrate. You see, I believe in integration if the individual wants to integrate and if the society wants to integrate them. But when you have individuals who do not want to integrate and a value system explicitly is against integration, by which, of course, I'm not speaking about all Muslims by any means, but we all know what I'm talking about that mainstream view that that you should not be mixing in the same way with the rest of the community because the rest of the country is decadent and so on and so forth. The problem, by the way, additionally being that they're not on to nothing when they make some of these criticisms of European society. And this is part of that second point I made about the values loss in European society, that it is a deep problem when your enemies are onto something, i.e. saying, this society seems to be hollowed out, tired, shallow, seems to advocate nothing very much other than sort of promiscuous spending and, going on holiday when you feel like it. That is not a values competitor to something that says we have the answers in totality to everything. And so, as I say, I think that it is very likely that this bit of the integration is the one that Europe may fail to swallow. We may not be able to digest this one. And if that is, I should add one other thing. Even mentioning that possibility is, of course, totally impossible, really, because people say there must be an answer. There must be an answer. You see, I say we would not have done what we've done for many years now on the immigration and integration thing if we had at least held in our minds as a potential, break on the whole thing, at least the possibility that it just might not work, that we might be screwing up the whole thing.
Well, I'll take the point in a second, but what I'm interested about as well is the sort of the identity, if you like, of immigrants coming here right now, and indeed in Europe, full stop. I think, again, looking from a particularly Jewish perspective, it's very interesting to see there's been an upsurge in anti-Semitism in the last few years that has coincided, maybe it's coincidental, maybe it's not, with this wave of immigration.
Yes.
Is there something in that Jews should be aware of?
Yes,
and others, for that matter?
There are two particularly notable things, I think, for the Jewish community in Europe as a whole. British Jewish community is in a much better position than that in continental Europe, which I go into in the book in some detail. They're obviously in continental Europe in a very serious position. It's less so in Britain, where for all sorts of reasons, I think things will be better for a while. But there are two particular challenges in a country like this one for the Jewish community. The first is the fact that the latest incomers turn out to be holding the oldest incomers, as it were, hostage most. What I mean is that one would have thought that one of the oldest minorities in Europe might have been treated well by other minorities. Of course, as I say, just one bit of our learning curve in Europe is that the latest minorities don't like the first minority, particularly don't like the first minority, and that Jews will find themselves, as they have across the continent in recent years, on the literal firing line of that for a long time to come. The second thing, which potentially is at least as big a problem, if not in the long term more so, is the issue of, and this is a very, very delicate and difficult issue, the issue of, as it were, Jews saying, we are a minority, we have been migrants, and therefore our attitude towards all migrants should be to welcome it in the manner in which we would have wished to be welcomed. And this is, by the way, and I say this repeat in the book about other aspects, this is a very noble sentiment. This is a good human instinct. It's like the instinct to save somebody from the sea. There are several things, though. First is the importance, I go so much in the book into this, the importance of keeping the difference between somebody actually fleeing war and somebody seeking economic preferment. the EU's own leadership admitted after the 2015 influx, when millions of people came into Europe, the EU's own leadership admitted that at least 60% of the people who arrived that year alone had no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the world. So first of all, it's a very, very big mistake for anybody to say all the migrants are effectively the same. But
Yes.
the bigger point
But they're coming from different places as well.
they're coming from different places. Almost no Syrian migration into, for instance, the Italian ports for a long time now, really. It's all sub-Saharan Africans. These people it's a pitiful situation they're fleeing from. But
Do you think, on a quick aside, do you think sub-Saharan Africans can integrate easily?
No. I mean, most of them are low-skilled. Many of them don't have the language skills. I mean, take an example like Sweden, which was the country that took per capita a roughly similar number of people as Germany in 2015 and has done in recent years. The Swedish economy, least of all, needs unskilled labor that doesn't speak Swedish. It just doesn't need it. And so we're setting up for our own sort of weakness in the short term, a very big long-term problem. But let me just bring back, if I may, to this issue of, as it were, the attitude of people who feel like they are migrants to these migrants. You see, it's my view that there's a very big problem for the Jewish community on this one down the road. I wrote about this in the Jewish Chronicle about a year ago, and I mean, it landed with a deafening silence, which sometimes is a sign that you're onto something. I was very concerned at the height of the crisis by the fact that, for instance, the chief rabbi, Rabbi Mervis, of whom I'm sure there's a lot of good to say, put himself front and center at the migration crisis in this country, went to Lesbos with other rabbis from Britain, by the way, wore a baseball cap to cover his kippah because he was told that you've got to be careful because people coming off the boats, if they see a Jew immediately, might attack the Jew. So there's some questionable decision making there anyway. But I think I think Jewish leadership in particular has to be very careful about this. Another example I would give is I don't want to beat up on him, as it were, but the chief rabbi attacking Donald Trump at the beginning of this year for the purported suspension of travel of people from 7 very unstable Muslim countries into the US. There is a risk that in order to, as it were, demonstrate we as Jews are not Islamophobic, not against the Muslims, are certainly not against the incomers, that, as it were, Jews and their leadership get ahead of public sentiment. And this is a very, very big problem long term because European public opinion is turning very fast against this whole thing. If you look at the polls across Europe, let me give you one very quick one done in February this year, which was done by a think tank in London that found that in 10 European countries, the public asked the question, do you want any more Muslims into your country? 8 out of the 10 countries, including France and Germany, the majority of people said, no, we want no more Muslims. And one of the only 2 countries in which that wasn't a majority opinion was this one, in which only 47% of the public agreed with this. So there is a big long-term problem for, as I say, one of the oldest minorities in Europe. If it looks like they are, as it were, beating the drum for more minorities of any kind to come in, more and more and more, because at some point it is possible, I don't say it as a scaremongering thing, I simply put the idea out there, it is possible that when the public sour even more on this, and we're speaking after events that have been unfolding overnight in Manchester, but it is possible that as the public sour on this more and more, they will blame the people, particularly the leaders, political and faith leaders, who argued that Europe should go through this massive experiment, which, as I say, may not work.
Now, we're running out of time, so I want to focus on what might make it work. As you stated, I think at the start, you have to, if you're going to have immigration, you need identity at the same time. Is the solution stopping immigration? Is it strengthening identity? Is it both? Clearly, as you've stated, and you've been quite open about it, this is not a specific Muslim issue. It's not a sub-Saharan African issue. It is not a, I suppose, Eastern European issue in terms of how this works. It's a question of numbers and it's a question of identity. So how do you marry those factors up? How do you make sure that actually this does work rather than it doesn't work?
Right. Well, as I say, the first thing is to consider the fact that it
Yeah.
might not.
But
That is
might
a
not.
very important...
You might argue that if we continue on the current path, it won't. But let's
Yes.
just discount that for
Sure.
one moment. It might be, as you say, we try everything and it doesn't work. Fine. Let's see what might work.
I have a chapter at the end of the book saying what we could do even now to deal with the migration. The migration issue is a huge issue of our time. As I say, it cuts down the center of each and every one of our psyches and our moralities about this. We want to be generous, but we can't be suicidal. So I say, what would we do even now to deal with this? Now, I have a set of things about how to stop or at least slow down the flow, and that is the overwhelming issue. You've got to slow the flow. If it continues at this rate, we, particularly on continental Europe, but as I say, Brexit, no Brexit, we're all in the same boat basically on this. We all have the same pathologies and reasons for this happening. But there are very specific things you can do to slow that flow. The first thing is you should stop using Frontex, the European Border Agency, as basically part of the smugglers' network. That the smugglers get the boats out now only a few miles, only put a small amount of fuel in them, because they know that then the European navies pick the boats up and they take them into Europe and they everything from there. And people almost never get repatriated or sent back, even when they're found out to be bogus in their claims. The second thing is, if you want to have a policy of asylum, and my own view is that we should, that Europe should be open to genuine asylum seekers, there are two things in particular you do. The first is that you lease land from, for instance, North African countries like Algeria, like Tunisia, like Libya, if we can at some point find such an agreement. And you process any applications there. You've got to stop people arriving in Europe and then for the work to begin, because basically once they're in, they're in. And we're talking about millions of people and many, many millions more in the years to come. The second thing from that is that if you do believe in that asylum system, as I do, then you should also look at things and take them seriously, such as temporary asylum. It is the experience of many countries in Europe that when they're told it's a temporary process, it's not a temporary process. People stay. In Sweden, they still have the immigrants from the Balkan wars. The Balkans have been at peace for 2 decades now, and there is no reason for people who sought asylum in Sweden to stay there other than that people stay.
Yeah, once they come,
stay.
yes.
And it's
build
perfectly
life.
understandable. They build life, they marry, or they have children, their children enter the school system, and so on. So, but the idea that sort of, as it were, hopeless has to be reversed. You have to work out how to do that on a strictly temporary basis, because otherwise my feeling is that the European public's opinions towards all of this is going to sour, and unfortunately it'll take the legitimate asylum seekers down with the, as it were, economic migrants. But beyond that, I mean, I say there's a lot of this is also to do with ourselves. I have a long passages of the book about what I see as being the existential issues of Europe. There are two things in particular. One is a guilt and the other is tiredness. The guilt is a historic guilt, particularly German guilt, which has been spread around the entire continent. And the second part, that tiredness, comes partly from that guilt, but partly from the feeling that Europe may have been seeing through in recent years the last of its dreams, and that the dream of, for instance, human rights may be dying before our eyes. Maybe maybe the last system we came up with after the terrible centuries of system after system that failed, religion, politics, all of which failed, that this last one, this belief in liberal rights, human rights, may be evaporating now as well. And this leaves us with this existential problem. I quote the French philosopher Chantal del Sol, who described in the 1990s modern European man as being like Icarus if he'd survived the fall, standing on the ground, singed, wondering about all of the wreckage of his dreams, but yet he's still here. So what does he do? And I think that one of the answers to all of these problems, which comes from within us in Europe, of whatever faith background or whatever cultural background we are, is to revive that at least discussion and thought about what this is that we are and what it is about ourselves that may be good. We've gone through this generational process of self-abnegation. And I think it's my observation that from traveling around the world, we've got it pretty good here. And one of the reasons why we have
I think many minorities agree with.
Absolutely. But you see, And many say quite the contrary. You often get the feeling that we are being described as the worst, most racist, most hostile countries in the world. And I always appeal to people: travel anywhere in the world and see what places is more enlightened, more tolerant than these ones. So there is a big risk in all of this. That it's like that it was Moynihan's law that the amount of human rights abuses in a country could be understood in directly inverse proportion from the number of complaints about human rights abuses in the country. In other words, the real totalitarian dictatorship, you don't hear the human rights abuses. It's the same thing with a country like this. You hear all the complaints because we're a free country. And unfortunately, there are people who take advantage of that self-doubt and that self-questioning and turn it into a self-laceration, which I think could be fatal.
Well, let's hope it isn't. Douglas, thank you for joining us today. The book can, of course, be purchased on Amazon or any good bookstore. That's all we've got time for on this edition of Current Affairs on JTV. Join us again soon for another episode. Thank you.